For our final speaker of the evening, we have Professor Michael Puett. Professor Puett is the Walter C. Klein Professor of Chinese History and teaches several classes, including the popular Ethical Reasoning 18, Classical Chinese Ethical and Political Theory. His research includes Chinese history, Chinese religion, as well as comparative history. Please join us in welcoming our final speaker of the evening, Professor Puett.
So, my deep thanks to the organizers for putting this together, and of course to all of you for coming. It's a tremendous honor to be here. To begin, let me take you on a thought experiment. Let's imagine it's 100 years from now, and for the sake of argument, let's assume that the world still exists and that there still is a human species. And let's continue that assumption by saying, and there's still historians around who are writing histories. I suspect if they do exist, they will write a history of a particular period of American history, late 20th, early 21st centuries. In other words, I'm embarrassed to say my generation, along something for the following lines. I suspect they will say this was a generation that was kind of unique in its complete complacency. This was a generation, again, I'm speaking of myself, deeply apologetic to what we have left to you. It's a world in which we were very much formed by, for example, 1989. Historians love dates, so they probably will put that as sort of the beginning point of this period. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And we thought, my generation, well, something cataclysmic has occurred. The last major ism of the 19th and 20th century, apart from what we have in America, has now died. And there was a strong sense in my generation that we basically had figured things out. That we basically had figured out how to organize the economic world, how to organize the political world. We thought we understood how human beings operated, that we're these good, rational human beings who decide rationally what we want and we're good autonomous selves. And we really thought that the basic problems had been solved. Indeed, there was even a book written very soon thereafter called The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, widely criticized for being rhetorically extreme, but nonetheless I think it captured the sense of the age, which was that history in the sense of radically new ideas had come to an end. We basically had solved the problems. And I suspect historians will also note that bizarrely that continued. It didn't just occur in '89, it's largely continued. And for an entire period of American history, we've really thought that to be the case. And meanwhile, they will probably say, all of this evidence has emerged, clearly, one would have thought, proving almost all of that to be, at a fundamental level, false. For example, psychological experiments, proving quite clearly that most of our folk understandings of how we operate as human beings is simply empirically wrong. And yet, didn't really seem to have much of a wider cultural impact. Other cultures emerging and becoming more significant, to which we foolishly said, well, that's fine because they used to be part of a traditional world. We are modern. We figured out things. And all that's occurring as these new economies begin developing around the world is they're throwing off their traditions, and they too are becoming moderns. They're becoming like us. So yeah, they might have a higher GNP in a few decades, but they'll be like us, so it'll be our world just expanded. And meanwhile, other crises began to emerge, some ecological crises, to which we thought, okay, well, we'll develop new technologies to solve those too, and so it's not fundamentally leading us to question anything. And then I suspect those historians will say, at the very conclusion of that chapter, that nice little world that my generation had painted for itself, that nice little world of believing that all of human history up until now had lived in some kind of traditional worldview where they didn't understand how things operated, and we now finally, after tumultuous 19th and 20th centuries, came up with the proper ideology, the proper vision of the world,